Every high priest is selected from among the people and is appointed to represent them in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. This is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins, as well as for the sins of the people. And no one takes this honor on himself, but he receives it when called by God, just as Aaron was. In the same way, Christ did not take on himself the glory of becoming a high priest, but God said to him, "You are my son, today I have become your father." And he says in another place, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered, and once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, and was designated by God to be high priest in the order of Melchizedek.
Thanks, Robin. For those who don't know me, if you're visiting here, my name's Russell. I'm part of the pastoral team. And this is sermon number 4 in a series that we've been doing on the book of Hebrews, or could also be titled Letter to Jewish Christians. And today we're looking at chapter 5, as was read to us by Shale, about Jesus being our high priest. Now, let me try and introduce that to you, because that's not a concept that we immediately connect with. A lot of us don't normally think of approaching a high priest, even though that would have been fairly common in certain religions in the world, but it's often not common here in Australia. There are still temples where you can go to and connect with a high priest, but it's not something you would do here, for example, at Windsor Road. So it's not a concept that we're very familiar with, but we are familiar with the idea of a representative. And I can tell you from my own personal experience, when you're in trouble and you really need help and you've got a problem to get fixed, it's great to have a good representative. Some years ago, I received a letter in the mail. Up to that point in time, everything was going really well, and then I got this letter, opened it up, and it was a letter from a group of people who wanted to take me to the Solicitor General on the charge that I had breached the law as a trustee of church property. When I read that letter, I was gutted. I mean, I was really upset. I thought, this could ruin me. This is terrible. And I was in a real fix. Well, you'll be pleased to know, of course, particularly since I'm a pastor here at a church at Windsor Road, that the case was dismissed. There was no evidence for the charge. But I can tell you, when it came to presenting a case before the Solicitor General of New South Wales, it was great to have a competent, well-equipped barrister who knew exactly what had to be argued, what case had to be presented in order to help fix my problem under the law. Well, in matters related to God, in dealing with God, in repairing and restoring a relationship with God, where you have breached God's good and just laws, or broken God's good and just laws, it's great to have a good representative. And if you don't think so, God does. God thinks so because he made such arrangements. That is exactly what Hebrews chapter 5 verse 1 is talking about. Open up your Bible and you'll read it there at verse 1. Every high priest is selected from among the people and is appointed to represent them in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sin. Now, this is exactly what God had arranged. The primary role of a priest, which was organized by God, he selected people and gave them this particular vocation to represent the people in order to repair or restore their relationship with him. And how did they do that? They would offer the case of a sacrifice and present this as their case, their argument to God for mercy. the mercy of forgiveness, and for grace, the help of God being reconciled to them and the relationship restored. So priests were like lawyers, really. They were religious lawyers, religious advocates who advocated and pled for the people in order to fix up their problems and restore them to God, that he might show mercy to them and give them the help they needed. And in matters of a broken relationship with God, or where you need God's help to live your life, it's good to have a good representative. God thought so, and he gave the people such. He gave them priests. And that's what Hebrews 5 is introducing. Now, priests in the early days were very helpful, but the writer's claiming in this chapter and in the verses that preceded the chapter that now that Jesus is here, he's a better representative. He's even more helpful. In fact, he is so helpful we don't need the old priesthood system. We don't need those advocates or representatives. They were good in their time, but they were limited. Jesus is the best representative. He is our advocate in heaven. And that's the argument that is introduced in chapter 4, verses 14 to 16. He says it there. In verse 14, he says, "We have a high priest who has entered into heaven." He's gone into the very presence of God to do what? To represent us and to obtain what we need, the mercy and the grace of God. And since he's our best representative, why would you go anywhere else? That is basically what chapter 4 is introducing, and that's what chapter 5 is going on to argue. He's saying, do you need your relationship with God repaired? Then go to Jesus. Do you need the help of God to live your life for God? To maintain that relationship? To keep going when you're facing troubles and difficulties? As they were, then go to Jesus. Now that's relevant to them because they were new Christians who were struggling to live as Christians, facing all sorts of difficulties, and they needed help. And he said, your best help is your man in heaven, your representative who's advocating for you. And it's relevant to us. You might think, I don't need a priest. Well, God is saying you do. And the best one you have, the best advocate and representative for you is Jesus. And that's why it touches us and is relevant to our need today. But the Jewish Christians that he was writing to had a problem, and we might have the same difficulty, and that was, well, how did Jesus become a high priest? We could accept that he was the Messiah, that he has been made the king and ruler of the people of God, that he was the great prophet of God who presents to us the truth and the messages of God. But since when did he become a high priest? And they had to be persuaded of that. And you need to be also persuaded. How is he your representative? You might say, well, okay, I accept he's the Son of God. I accept he is God's representative. But how is he my representative? How is he my man in heaven advocating for me? Is that really his role? And they needed to be persuaded that that was his role, and we need to be absolutely convinced that that is what he does. He lives and he works for you. See, many of us are not persuaded of that. And they had to be persuaded, and so do we. So, there are two arguments that are presented in chapter 5, verses 1 to 10, where the writer seeks to convince people, you need to realize this, I have a representative in heaven. And the first argument is, God has made a special appointment. God planned this and has appointed Jesus to be our representative. This is actually God's plan, and it's God's mission, and God carried it out. It's his arrangement, his special appointment to make Jesus our man representing us in heaven. You see, in Jewish minds, that wouldn't have been immediately obvious. They would have said, well, hang on, just wait a minute. Think about this. We know God made an arrangement in the past, in our tradition, in our culture, for there to be priests and a high priest, but he gave that honor of representing the people to Aaron, the brother of Moses, one of the founding fathers of Israel. And he specifically selected Aaron and gave it to him, and he said, you and your descendants will be the high priests, and the priests will come from your tribe, the tribe of Levi. That was God's choice and God's arrangement. So these Jewish Christians would have been thinking, hang on, Jesus was from the tribe of Judah, so he's from the wrong family. Secondly, he never went to Jerusalem and had an official ceremony whereby hands were laid on him or oil was put on his head and he was anointed as a high priest. There was no ceremony. In fact, he was crucified outside the city wall. He never wore the high priestly robes. He never did any priestly duty, so how can he be a high priest? And that's why in verses 5 and 6, the writer begins to quote Psalm 2 and Psalm 110. If you've got your Bible still open, look at that. It says, Christ did not take to himself the glory of becoming a high priest, but God said to him, "You are my son, today I have become your father." That's in Psalm 2 verse 7. And then he says in another place, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." That is Psalm 110 verse 4. Now he's making a connection, but this is his argument. What he's saying is this: I'm not inventing this. In fact, this has already been recorded and was predicted in our scriptures in the Hebrew Bible by David when he wrote Psalm 2:7 and when he wrote Psalm 110, particularly verses 1 to 4. David was telling us that it was the will of God, the plan of God, and he was speaking, foretelling the future, that there would be one day when the Messiah would be announced as the king and co-ruler of creation. Psalm 2 verse 7, "Today you are my son and I have begotten you." And it goes on in that psalm, if you read the rest of the psalm, because you might pause and say, well, okay, that could be applied to David. But if you go on to read the rest of the psalm, it says to this person who God declares, "You are my son, today I have begotten," and don't get worried about the word begotten. That just means today I have made you. You are made, you are appointed to this. And what does it go on to say? "You will rule the nations. I will give the nations as your inheritance." Well, David never received all the nations as his inheritance. He did receive some of them, but not all of them. But to this one, the Messiah would be given all the nations. And then in Psalm 110, verses 1, just a few verses before the one he quotes, God also says of the Messiah and welcomes him and says, "Come and accept the throne. Come up and sit beside me at my right hand." Now, what he then goes on to say, not only will I be making you co-ruler of all creation, this is of the Messiah, but you will be a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. So what this writer is arguing is, do you see what David was talking about? He was saying the Messiah would not only become the ruler of the nations, the ruler of the earth, and the ruler of creation, but this Messiah would also be a priest while exercising that rule. While he's ruling the creation, he will be our representative. That's his point. Saying David said that because God planned it. It was always going to be this way. And in the resurrection of Jesus, this writer now saw that God had fulfilled his plan. Because Jesus had been resurrected and taken into heaven, and he saw this as a special promotion, as an appointment, taking him into heaven and giving him the rule of creation. But it's not the rule of creation just as a king, but also as a priest. And that's exactly what Melchizedek was. He was a king and a priest. He's mentioned in the ancient writings of the Bible as a king and a priest. And that's why Jesus is also aligned with him, is of the same order, because he too rules as a king, but he ministers as a priest. And remember, whenever you see that word priest, as our representative. Now, that's an incredible arrangement. And actually, even the amazing thing often escapes us here, because we can read that and we can hear what this writer is saying, and then